Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Laetitia and Transition to Zero for sponsoring this very important and timely conference. I noted the support of the US NIC and NewScale on the screen, so thanks to them as well. I wish I could be there with you. The last time I was in Croatia was 1980. It wasn't even Croatia, it was still Yugoslavia. And I was in Split, and the walls were all covered with massive portraits of Marshal Tito. So, my, how the world has changed. So, I was thinking a lot about history and getting ready for this short presentation, and I was reminded of the famous philosopher George Santayana and his statement that those who do not study history are condemned to repeat it. And even more so, perhaps, the statement by the famous Prince Talleyrand, who had been the genius of diplomacy at the time of Napoleon. And after Waterloo and Napoleon's defeat, when Louis XVIII was restored to the throne, Talleyrand famously said about the Bourbon kings of France, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the thing about the Bourbon kings of France is they forget nothing, but they learn nothing. So, why do I say that? I say that because in my lifetime, we can think back to 1973 and their Arab oil embargo. And everyone realized for the first time, in many respects, that energy was not just another commodity, that it was a critically important lifeblood to all of our economies. President Nixon in the United States launched Project Independence, and there was a great wave of enthusiasm for nuclear energy as a means to get off of the horrible dependence that we found ourselves on OPEC-based oil. There was a huge wave of construction. President Pompidou in France announced his tout nucléaire decision, which led France to, in a relatively short period of time, get 80% of their energy from electricity. And you had construction beginning on around 170 gigawatts of nuclear power plants. And the plants that were built at that time actually now comprise about 40% of today's nuclear capacity. Of course, all of that came to a screaming halt when you had the misfortunes of the accidents at 3 Mile Island, as well as Chernobyl. Many things happened in addition to those accidents. There were cost challenges, there were regulatory challenges. And so we went into a long hiatus in many countries in terms of nuclear. But by and by, we forgot again, and the memories faded of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. And then people became increasingly and appropriately concerned about carbon. And so you had this second wave of enthusiasm for nuclear energy in the 2000s, led to something like 500 gigawatts being ordered. But then, of course, we had Fukushima, right? And so once again, we came to a screeching halt, and that persisted really for many years. And then finally, we find ourselves becoming dependent, not this time on OPEC oil, but now on Russian natural gas. And so we then, even after the Crimean invasion, when there were certain sanctions that were imposed against Russian oil and gas, LNG terminals were built, but dependence kept growing through the 2010s on Russian gas. And then we find after the horrible events in Gaza and the beginning of the assault by the Houthis in the Red Sea, that the Straits of Hormuz, as well as the Red Sea, were now critically vulnerable points. And the Suez and Red Sea carrying together 12% of global sea trade, 30% of container traffic, 15% of globally traded crude. And by October 24th, the volume of that transit fell by nearly 60%. Rerouting added 10 to 14 days to delivery times, added about $1 million per vessel in extra fuel costs. And Europe responded appropriately with their Operation Aspides to try to secure international shippings. But that helped, but it did not help completely because as of January, before the war started in Iran, they were now around 45 ships transiting Suez daily, which was down from like 70 that were transiting the Suez Canal in the period before the Houthis began to attack these ships. So now we reach the current crisis in Iran. I'm sure everyone in this room knows that Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, has called the combined impacts of this war the greatest threat to global energy security in history. We all know the numbers: 20 million barrels of oil that pass a day through the strait, 20% of global seaborne oil trade. LNG is nearly as bad, where Qatar supplies around 16% of Europe's natural gas and now has had to declare force majeure on those contracts owing to the attack on the Ras Laffan natural gas facility, which has been offline since March 2nd. And we have now experienced a 70% price hike in gas and 60% oil price hikes in Europe. There aren't any easy solutions here. The pipeline capacity of the East-West pipeline in Saudi Arabia and the Fujairah pipeline in UAE cover less than half of the volume that passed through the strait. And the Houthis could start attacking again anytime. And of course, the strait remains closed. So once again, we find ourselves in the situation of unacceptable dependence on Middle East fossil fuels. And of course, the three Seas countries are exquisitely exposed to some of these challenges because not only are they dependent on natural gas from Russia, but they are also dependent for nuclear fuel on Russia. The Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria, all those that operate the VVER reactors that were built by Russia are dependent in large part on Russian fuel. 19 VVRs, to be specific, are operating in the EU, and this has now created a challenge which we've started working on, but we have a lot more work to do. So how should the nuclear industry and investment community respond? Well, one answer would be to double down on wind and solar, but that would indeed remind us all, I think, of the Bourbon Kings of France, because that would have shown we've learned nothing when it comes to depending on critical oil energy supplies on third parties that you may not have coincident interest with. Obviously, the role of China in renewable energy has been critical. China accounts for 74% of the world's battery pack and component exports. They control 85% of the world's battery cell production. And when it comes to solar, China produced 93.2% of the world's polysilicon, 96.6% of the wafers, 92.3% of the photovoltaic cells, and 86.4% of photovoltaic modules. So to hop out of the frying pan of Russian dependence into the fire of Chinese dependence does not sound like a good national security or energy security answer. And therefore, nuclear once more steps into the breach, I hope. It's obviously, as again, people in this room know, it's clean, it's affordable, it's reliable. It avoids those dangerous dependencies that oil and gas and even renewables have. And it is a uniquely concentrated form of energy. And again, it's well known in this room, 30 tons of fabricated nuclear fuel are required for a 1 gigawatt plant per year compared to 3 million tons of coal. And so uranium is a intrinsically portable and tradable commodity. It's easy to establish strategic inventories, up to 2 years of them, and you can't easily do that with LNG. And strategic petroleum reserves have also been shown not to serve as a panacea, and frankly are a tiny fraction of the traded volume. And they are more of, if I may say, a psychological tool than a physical security measure. So we have a strong motivation now combining the recent crises and shocks in the Middle East, and coupled with the demand coming from not just the AI revolution, but also the overall growth, reindustrialization, and so forth in Europe. There's a huge demand now for new European projects to embrace nuclear energy, and it is an appropriate way to do this. And it's also not a brand new idea. We already have a huge contribution of nuclear in these countries. Slovakia has 54% of its electricity, Hungary 46%, Bulgaria 44%, the Czech Republic 36%, Slovenia 37%, and Romania 18%, which have established a proven track record for nuclear in the three SI countries. They're rapidly reindustrializing. They need cheap, reliable, affordable 24/7 power, and this is where nuclear fits in. Specifically, let me address some of the advantages that I think nuclear provides in this region. Number one, nuclear will allow the three SI countries to attain sovereignty over their fuel cycle. As I mentioned earlier, There's a huge diversity of sources of uranium. It's widely distributed in countries around the world. We know who they are. It's Niger, it's Namibia, it's Canada, it's Australia, it's many countries. Kazakhstan, obviously the largest at this point supplier. But we do still have bottlenecks, which we'll talk a little bit about in the supply chain, specifically in uranium enrichment and conversion. These are being addressed, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Given the energy density that we've talked about in terms of nuclear, as I mentioned, it is something that can be stored and therefore provides a greater buffer against geopolitical shocks. It gets us out of dependence on Rosatom and its progeny, such as 10X for nuclear fuel. And there has been progress made in this area as well. Both Framatome and Westinghouse are now making VVER fuel. I was very proud when I was deputy secretary to authorize in an earlier day the fabrication of VVER fuel elements by Westinghouse. It made the Russians we were working with still at that time extremely unhappy, but it was obviously the right thing to do. And at this point, we now have successful deliveries that are already taking place. I know that in May 25, the fuel deliveries from both Westinghouse and Framatome reached Temelin in the Czech Republic. So this shows how we can actually work together to relieve some of these bottlenecks. The other way, apart from the fuel cycle, that we can cooperate in relieving ourselves of this unacceptable dependence on Russia is obviously building reactors. And we just heard from Mike Donahue speaking about what Oklo can do. And I know others present in the room have talked about these opportunities as well. So nuclear, I think, overall is a great solution for the three SI countries. And I would like to close by offering some specific recommendations of what I think industry and investors should be doing in respect of the opportunity to make nuclear a greater contribution still to the three SI countries. Number one, I do believe that industry should continue to focus on onshoring the fuel cycle, increasing the robustness of European and allied fuel supply chains, and specifically with regards to uranium enrichment and high-assay, low-enriched uranium fuel, which is the fuel of choice of all of the so-called Gen 4 reactors that use fast neutrons. They need an enrichment not of 3 or 4% or 5% like the traditional LWRs and like, for example, the NuScale design, but the reactors that have fast neutrons obviously require a higher level of enrichment. These would be the gas-cooled reactors, molten salt reactors, and the liquid metal reactors, such as you just heard about from Mike Donahue. At this point, Russia still controls over 40% of the world's supply of enriched uranium. Fortunately, the United States government has begun to take vigorous action to relieve this bottleneck. The U.S. Department of Energy has invested $2.7 billion in building additional enrichment capacity. I'm hoping to see these investments converted into holes dug and concrete poured. Of course, the company that Laetitia mentioned that I used to lead is already investing in expanding its capacity. That's Centrus. It's already producing high-assay, low-enriched uranium from a small cascade, but now has the resources to the U.S. government and will be going, I'm sure, to capital markets to raise the funds required to build out that domestic capacity. Number two, I think that it would be useful for the 3Cs countries to consider coordinating their efforts in terms of reactor purchases. Everything has to do with scale, and we all are very eager to see us move beyond the first-of-a-kind challenges in terms of cost and getting to the nth-of-a-kind benefits. And I think that since many of the countries in the region may not be ordering large numbers of reactors, at least in the first instance, there could be some benefit in coordination of their efforts to think about sharing a demand signal that would create enough of a demand for enough reactors from one supplier to start to achieve some of those scale economies. Third, I think that the private sector can and should work directly with governments to participate in nuclear project development. That's happened in the United States in recent years, where private companies have made direct power purchase agreements for nuclear energy. Again, this is something that you just heard about from Mike Donahue. And this did a couple of things. Number one, it restructured the traditional financing model for nuclear. And number two, it spurred dialogue and pushed public sector to really meet the moment. The obvious case in point that sort of created the precedent we're all now looking to follow is Microsoft when it signed up for 3 Mile Island to be reopened and renamed the Crane Energy Center after our dear departed colleague Chris Crane. We've had Google and Amazon signing with SMR developers, and we are now looking, as again you heard from Mike Donahue, the hyperscalers with their tremendous demand for fresh electricity and tremendous checkbooks to underwrite large capex expenditures. That could be a game changer. This, I think, could be a model that could be followed in the 3SI countries. Private sector could take the lead and make agreements directly with the nuclear power suppliers. There are obviously very large energy-intensive private enterprises in a lot of these countries. And due to the reindustrialization and manufacturing growth in the region, I think there's a real opportunity to be had there. Number four, I think that regulatory harmonization should be pushed across the 3SI countries. I remember actually when I was at the National Security Council during the Clinton administration, I received an unexpected call from the head of the World Bank, of the U.S. Exim Bank, Ken Brody, at the time, and he was asking me whether the United States should support a Westinghouse deal to build instrumentation and control for the Temelín plant in the Czech Republic. And I said, well, why are you asking me this question? And he said, well, because Austria is complaining, right? And so I said, all right, well, we've not looked at this question before. So I assigned my team to look into it. And we found that the Czech Republic already had a very sophisticated, very capable nuclear regulatory. So I went back to Ken Brody and said, go ahead. There's a very strong infrastructure. That kind of regulatory experience, which exists in a number of the countries in the region, is something that I think can and should be shared. By the way, I don't think this is confined to the 3SI countries. I think we should look at harmonization writ large. I just had the opportunity to interview the new NRC chair, Ho Ni, and I know he's interested in doing this. And I think globally, for us to become efficient in the deployment of nuclear at large scale, we need to have improved harmonization of regulatory frameworks so we don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time somebody wants to build a new reactor in a new country. So I think these are some of the very specific ideas that I hope this conference will provide people an opportunity to discuss and advance. In conclusion, we have had, unfortunately, tragedy as our teacher in the broader Middle East crisis that we're now enduring, and we will all hope for as speedy as possible and successful conclusion of that conflict. But it shows us beyond peradventure why nuclear energy is so critical for the 3Cs countries and why supply chains in particular must be built, in some cases rebuilt and reinforced to make sure that the supply chain can support the needs for the energy demands of these growing economies. We've suffered through the Houthi campaign. We've suffered through the Iran closure of the Straits of Hormuz, and we've got to learn that lesson and not repeat the situation of the Bourbon kings of France of continuing to learn and unlearn the same historic lessons. Because once one makes these kinds of century-long investments in nuclear, there will be a level of energy security and robust, secure energy supply that can support the growing needs of this critical part of the world. I wish I could be there with you. I am sure that this conference will contribute to some of the outcomes that we're talking about here today. I want to close where I began by thanking the Laetitia and the organizers. It seems like a fantastic conversation you're having there, and I wish you every success, because success in the room that you are now inhabiting will lead to success to all of the 3Cs countries in the years to come. So thank you very much.